Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. Hope you're well. Hope you're enjoying the beginning of 2024. On this week's episode of the show, I speak with Nate Braun. Nate is a Python programmer and writer who's written several books on how to use Python to analyze and visualize data around sports. So football, baseball, soccer, hockey, and basketball. Those are the five, I think. I reached out to Nate because I saw his book on learning to code in Python with hockey data. And of course, I'm a hockey fan, so I reached out to him to see more about what he's doing in that book. And so after reading that book, I went back to him and said, hey, would you like to come on the podcast? Let's talk about your approach, your background, and how you think about visualizing or analyzing data when it comes to sports. Because sports, I think, and you'll hear this in the conversation with Nate, sports is something that many of us are interested in, if not fully engaged. Maybe, at least we kind of know it's there. But it's a great way to work with data because for many of these sports, there is so much data. And so it offers a fairly unique, I think, opportunity to practice our skills and learn new skills when it comes to data visualization, programming, HTML, data science, because there's just so much opportunities there. So Nate and I sit down and talk about his process and his background and where he came from and how he decided to write these books. We talk about the various different sports that he's written about and talk about, obviously, Python and his process for writing these books and doing the data analysis in Python and why he likes Python over some other tools that many of you may be using in your day-to-day work. So I think you'll find this an interesting conversation, especially if you're interested in learning or upping your skills in the Python programming language. So here's my conversation with Nate Braun, author of several books on learning to code. Hey, Nate, welcome to the show. Good to meet you.
Hey, you too, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is exciting. Madison guys come together for
That's right.
Right. Maybe not enough beer for for a Madison reunion.
No,
but still.
yeah, not necessarily in the morning.
Yeah. So I reached out because I saw these books that you've written that are data viz coding, but rooted in sports, which is, I think, a really interesting way to get about teaching people how to work with data, since so many of us like sports. So, and you were gracious enough to send me over the hockey one, which I've been really enjoying. So I thought maybe we would talk about pieces of the different books, but maybe we could start with introductions, like what's your background? How did you decide to write not just one book on data and coding, but like several books on data and coding? And then we can dive into some of the specifics.
Yeah, for sure. So my background actually is not in coding. It's a little bit into data. I did economics. We, like you said, have the same alma mater at UW Wisconsin. But so I did economics. I did some of the modeling and stuff, but really not a lot of coding coming out of school. And so my background was originally in environmental stuff. I came out of school like working on the BP oil spill. But I kind of realized, like, doing all that and building those models, which do involve, a decent amount of coding. We did it in Stata back then.
Yeah.
That, I enjoyed the kind of modeling and data piece of it more so than, like specifically the environmental stuff. So I was happy building models. It didn't necessarily matter what they were.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to do more of that. So, I started with football, fantasy football. Yeah. So I've been in a league for a long time with a bunch of buddies, and we're just competitive. We're all trying to beat each other every year and stuff. So I started working on some models for that. And then with this kind of entrepreneurial streak in me, I decided to sell the models.
Okay.
So, even back then it was just kind of like, I didn't know anything about coding or web development or whatever. So I found some WordPress plugins and it would upload the CSV of the rankings every week.
Right.
And I got some interest via that, but like not a ton. I mean, there's just so much out there with fantasy football.
Yeah.
It was a pretty good model, and it was kind of, I think I was doing some cutting edge stuff. So occasionally I would get people emailing me, hey, this is awesome, but what I really want to do is like know how to make a model like this, so can you teach me? So I eventually decided to get into the books, and the first one was Learn to Code with Fantasy Football. So yeah. I had learned Python as part of building all these models and putting them online and stuff like that. And then and meanwhile doing that, I had kind of, after the BP oil spill wound down, I'd used that knowledge and my Python knowledge, learning from doing these football models, to get data science jobs here locally in
Hmm.
Milwaukee. So I worked at a startup for a while, then I worked at a bigger company for a while. But it was really kind of doing these same, data manipulation and visualization techniques that I had been doing as part of the football stuff.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I started working that on the side, like working on these books. And I'd get up early, and we had little
Yeah.
kids at the time, so it was like, yeah, getting up early and
Yeah.
working on the weekends and stuff like that.
Yeah.
um, but I kind of just basically wanted to teach all of the data science concepts generally, like using this sports application.
Yeah.
So it's not like the football book, it's not like you'd be able to read that and then work for the Packers necessarily or
Yeah.
something like that. You're not doing like super cutting edge, on like the frontier of these sports where you can work for a team, but it's
Sure.
more teaching these concepts with like in an interesting way. So
Right.
that's kind of how it all got started.
So, so this was around what the BP was like 2012, something around there.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
right?
2010 is when it happened, and yeah, I
Yeah.
graduated 2011 and was doing
Right.
that. I mean, it took like 5-ish years to kind of wrap up. So,
So it's been since then, like a decade or so.
yep.
Do you, um, if you were starting now, this is like totally separate from the books, but like,
Yeah.
is the fantasy football like marketplace so saturated at this point with models that like trying to build the new models like kind of impossible at this point?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that there's just so many people, like it's like you want to work on a fantasy football model and come up with fantasy advice and like do all
Hmm.
this stuff, you know,
Yeah.
there's just so many people who are like to do that, and
Right.
they like to do it for free and for fun and all
Yeah.
that stuff. So it's
Yeah.
just really hard to, if you want to break into the fantasy advice space, it's sort of like, you know, good luck. Like, I hope.
Yeah.
I mean, and
No.
it can be a good fun thing, but you're not, like,
Yeah.
everyone is working on their own models, and that's why these books have done so well. Like
Right.
my target is people who like don't have a computer science background, but do like messing around with fantasy stats and sports stats in Excel, kind of like don't necessarily know where to take it from there, like how
Right.
to do, what's the next level beyond like Excel formulas and stuff like
Right.
that.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so
I mean,
that,
now,
and
yeah, I was gonna say now when you watch any sport on TV, all the ads are,
yeah,
betting and fantasy,
yeah, for
fantasy. So it's
sure.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, the industry's kind of like exploded a bit. So I can
Yeah,
imagine like
definitely.
how hard it would be now to do
Yeah,
this.
for sure. And I don't, yeah, I'm not a big fan. I don't personally bet too much, or, I mean, just it's like the 8%
Yeah.
rake or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like with my economics background, it just, it's not a zero sum game, it's a negative sum game,
Right.
the
Right.
fact that you have to beat it by that much. So I prefer, um, yeah, I prefer kind of, I'm happy just to, teach people using this stuff.
Right.
And that's really kind of what I try to do is, again, like you learn the data, like it's like, okay, combine two data sets together. We have a bunch of hockey players and we have a bunch of their goals. Like, here's how you combine the data together, and here's how you
Yeah.
do a merge, and here's an inner and outer join and all that stuff.
Right.
So people, you can learn that, and then you get a job at wherever.
Right.
And
Right.
it's a different data source, but you still got to know how to merge them together and stuff like
Right.
that.
So it seems like your goal, because there's a book. I've got the hockey one. There's a baseball
Mhm.
one. There's a
Yep.
soccer one. There's a
Yep.
football one. Right.
Mhm.
Um, so was your thinking all the way like people are interested in sports, people want to learn to code, and this is a way to tap into that
Yeah.
interest, and it could be music, could be anything, but like sports seems like a pretty universal
Yeah.
thing to get started in.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, sort of. I mean, that's definitely what it was for the football one, and then the
Hmm.
football one did well. And then I would get people reaching out about other sports.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
hey, like, I really like football, but football is not my thing. Or I had a lot of people reaching out from Europe, saying like, I thought this
Sure.
was about football. Like,
Right. Right.
so
Yeah.
so then I did baseball after that, just
Yeah.
because it was, I mean, and it was all kind of market driven. Like, it
Sure.
was selling well enough that, it made sense to do. So
Yeah.
originally so we had we had our first kid and I was working on this stuff, early mornings and stuff. Then we had our second kid and it was like, okay, I don't have time to do this
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
So I went down to 4 days a week at my day job.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent one day a week working on my own stuff. And
Uh-huh.
this book was one of the first things.
Right.
And then ended up doing well where it was like, oh, this is 20% of my salary. Maybe I'll just do this. And
Yeah.
then after that, I cranked out the baseball one, that did well. All these other sports, they're not really like, totally my sports. Like I grew
Right.
up following football. I do fantasy football. Like I like that well enough to build the models on my own time, but I,
Yeah.
don't necessarily know that much about baseball.
Right.
So again, it's sort of like, all this stuff, like building the sports model and taking that to another job. That's kind of what I had to do with taking this football book and applying it to baseball and
Sure.
hockey and everything else. So
Yeah.
there was some like deep diving into the sports and kind of like figuring it all out.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that process. I mean, it's I'm guessing it's the case that the football one was sort of the hardest to write because just writing it, getting all the code, laying it all out, getting all the
Yeah.
images. But like, did you find was it markedly easier to do each subsequent book?
Yeah,
Because
it
you sort of had
definitely
it, but like
was.
you didn't know the sport. So like,
Yeah,
was
for
it
sure.
trade-off?
Yeah, and I knew the sports well enough. Like
Yeah.
I'm not like a huge. I don't know all the NHL players, but I like play in a hockey league,
Right.
once a week and play
Yeah.
pickup basketball and all that stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I know them. It's not like I didn't like them. I know them. I definitely know them well enough. But it's like, if you just, I had to like look up,
Yeah.
like just like the famous like no one like make sure I have all my bases covered and all that
Sure.
stuff. But
Right.
so yeah, it was they're all like basically they follow the same pattern,
Mhm.
So it was the football one was like kind of the path breaking thing, and the other one was sort of like fitting the sports into that.
Right.
So I did football first, and then baseball like a year or 2 years later, and then I did hockey, soccer, and basketball all at the same time.
Gotcha.
And those sports are pretty similar in the fact that it's like very free flowing,
Mhm.
like it's um like a lot of the data I found was like XY coordinates, for
Mhm.
passes.
Yeah.
And like you pass in every sport, you shoot in every sport.
Yeah.
So that was sort of helpful when doing it.
And was
To
finding that data hard to do?
It's
Or
it's
hard to
easier
find?
for some sports than others. It wasn't ever too bad.
Yeah.
Soccer was probably the hardest, just because
Oh, okay.
I'm not even sure why, but a lot of these, like the NHL and baseball and NFL and NBA, they have kind of like undocumented APIs where you
Right.
can just grab a bunch of
Kind of
data.
figure it out.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
It seems like the hardest part would be the data visualization chapter. So like in the
Uh,
hockey one, you've got one of the shot graphs. It's laid
Yeah.
out in a rink, but like you
Yeah.
can't really do that. The exact same thing for
Yeah.
baseball, right? But
You
like,
can't do it for baseball and you can't do it for football, but I did do it for I did do it for soccer and
soccer and
basketball.
yeah.
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 So those were the ones I was doing at the same time. And so that's kind of why I did
Oh,
it that way.
yeah.
Yeah. So it was not too bad to do the data visualization.
Yeah.
I don't know if in the book, I talk a lot about Seaborn, which is a Python,
Yep.
a Python library that I like a lot. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, so I'm
yeah,
not a Python coder. So tell
Okay.
me, I guess the question would be sell me on, although you're not gonna be able to, but that's okay. But like sell the listener
give it a good try,
on
yeah.
using Python over,
Yeah.
R or any other language
Yeah.
someone wants to choose from.
So I'm not anti R. I mean,
Mhm.
the early football model I did it in R.
Mhm.
I think my understanding is that, since then, the kind of direction has been sort of moving towards Python in terms of market share and stuff.
Mhm.
I have a blog post or an email I sent out to some people asking, like, exploring this question, like R or Python.
Yeah.
And there's one guy I saw, like, his name is like OpenWar or something like that. He did a kind of a mini study using Stack Overflow, like
Mhm.
the kind of questions people ask and stuff, like where people get into programming, the languages they move to and adopt
Yeah.
and all that. And he found that actually a lot of R movers end up moving to Python.
Oh.
And then so he has this big graph of all these programming languages, like where he calls them terminal nodes, like where you move to and you stop because you can't find anything better. And Python 3 is one of those.
Right.
So, and that was my journey. I mean, I did Stata
Mhm.
back in the day, which is like more so in the economics field. I did
Yeah.
SAS in grad
Yeah.
school. I did
Yeah.
some R, like all that stuff.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, Python, I think a good thing about Python is obviously the machine learning stuff, like the
Hmm.
scikit-learn
Right.
is pretty well developed. And then these data visualization chapters, or packages like Seaborn is the one that I really like.
Yeah.
Um, and, just the ability to do all that. But I mean, they're really pretty similar. So
Right. So tell me about the actual writing. So I can imagine like a lot of the data or data viz books that are in R, they're using R Markdown or using Cordo to
yeah,
actually like basically write the book within the
yeah.
code. Did
Yep.
you approach these books the same way in Python,
Um,
obviously?
I wrote all mine. I mean, I wrote all mine in Markdown,
Hmm.
and then I used Pandoc. It's like
Yeah.
the thing to convert Markdown to, a PDF.
Right.
So that's really like what I did. Um, I like using the terminal, and, Vim is my text editor that
Ah.
I that
Yeah.
I really like to use. I'm actually working on a new book on kind of like tooling,
Hmm.
that covers Vim and the terminal and all that stuff.
Right.
So I wrote it all in that. Then I'd have my Python REPL up on the side, and I would, you know, copy and paste the input and output and put
Right.
all that in the book.
Right.
So yeah,
Um. So I mean the thing that I've always, I guess, known about Python is that it's really good at web scraping. And so
yeah.
so because you're pulling all these APIs, did you find that
Mhm.
like just using Python made that process, because you've got all
Yeah,
these different sports, like so much easier?
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yep. Yeah, Python is good at web scraping. There's a package that's kind of like some of these packages, they're third-party packages, but it's
Yeah.
like everyone uses them.
Right.
So it like might as well almost like be part of Python itself. And so the
Right.
web scraping one is called Beautiful Soup.
Hmm.
Um, and it lets you, just go to a website and get data and do all that. I mean, the problem is a lot of these websites now are with just so much JavaScript on the front end and like single page apps, like you can't really scrape it anymore.
Hmm.
Like so Beautiful Soup works by connecting to the website and getting the HTML, and you can like work with the tags and get the data. But a lot of these websites now are just like kind of dynamically populated where like
Yeah.
that doesn't work. So to
Right.
build a web scraper, you have to like actually build uh, some code that like opens up a web browser and like will like automate the clicking around and getting it that way.
Oh, right. Right.
And that's another package called Selenium that Python covers, that people do that in.
Right. So have you thought about branching out and doing similar books for other content areas, other data areas?
I've thought about it. I mean, I think so. I think the book, I think like realistically, I think the book is well structured and is like a good introduction
Yeah.
to like all this stuff, like whether you like sports or not, and I've
No,
had
right.
people,
Right.
yeah. And I had early on, I had a coworker that I worked with, like she was from China,
Hmm.
she like didn't really speak that good of English. She knew nothing about American football,
Yeah.
but she wanted to learn pandas. And so I sent her the book and she's like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
And so I've thought about doing that,
Hmm.
and like making kind of a general purpose one.
Hmm.
I mean, I think there's maybe I'll do it someday. I think there's a lot of general purpose stuff out there,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so it's sort of harder to kind of like attract attention or get people in. But maybe I'll do something like that.
Do you if someone said, I want to learn Python, and but they're kind of, they like all sports, whatever, is
Yeah,
there one of these books that you think is more generally applicable? And the reason I ask is when I think about the hockey one, you've got the shot
yeah,
map, for example, which is like basically just a map, so it seems
yeah,
like it's pretty easy to take that
yeah,
skill and transfer it to,
yeah,
I want to make
yeah,
just like a dot map.
yeah.
So are any of these that you think extend well to the person who like kind of doesn't really care about the sport so much but just wants to get that broad intro?
I think no. I think they're all pretty good in that.
Hmm.
I think football and baseball, there's just a little bit more data. Like,
Yeah.
again, because hockey and soccer and basketball are so free flowing, like
Hmm.
that's why I actually did a lot with the shot data, because it's like the shot data you have, you know the distance from the goal, you know that like the type of shot, like is it a slap shot, is it a wrister in the NBA, is it like a step back,
Right.
whatever, like
Right.
and in soccer is it left foot, right foot, or a header. And so like you just have certain like attributes on every shot where you can kind of like break it down like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the books, I actually spent a lot of time with the shot data just because it was like a good data set,
Right.
and you can build a model like, does the shot go in or not? And like, how does the shot go in like relative to distance away from the goal? Like, how does that change?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so with the nice thing about football and baseball is that like everything's like that,
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
not just the shots. Like football, you have a play and you can say like, what's the down, how far do you have to go, and like, is it a run or a pass? In
Yeah.
baseball, there's even more stats, like what's the type of pitch and like what's the count and all that stuff. So i
Right.
i would say, like, if people were purely sport agnostic and wanted to just stick with one of them, I would say, football or baseball just has a little bit more variety in
Right.
terms of data.
Right.
I mean, the football one I've actually extended where I made, um, I call it like the developer kit. So
Mm.
after you read the football book and like have this basic knowledge down, I sell another thing that I sell, every year, like the 2024 version is out right now,
Mm-hmm.
where you get that, and then it gives access to an API that I built,
Mm-hmm.
where you get access to like these fantasy simulations from the old model I did,
Yeah.
back in the day. And then we work through using that API to build like a couple of projects that analyze your own team. So
Oh, okay.
so we work on, if your fantasy league is on ESPN,
Yeah.
one of the first projects we do is like, okay, how do we connect to ESPN and get that data
Right.
so you can see who's on your team and who's playing this week and all that.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
then we take that and we build, a who do I start calculator. So like it'll
Right.
run through all your backup options, like run the simulation, say, oh, this person increases your probability of winning.
Right.
um, we do a league analyzer, so it's like you get the probabilities for every matchup, or it's like who's going to score the high this week, all that stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
that and that's just, I think, due to the kind of my original
Yeah.
love and passion for football.
Yeah.
That's why I've gone and built all that out there. So if people
Right.
like really didn't care, and you wanted to kind of get the full experience doing the football one and then doing the kit afterwards
Yeah.
is pretty cool, I
And
think.
is the kit like, is it videos, or is it's step by
It's
step
still that's the
instructions?
same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. It's the
Yeah.
step by step
Yeah.
instructions. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Um, so aside from trying to write these books around having job and kids and
Yeah.
family and everything else, what for you was the most fun part about going through the process?
I think the most fun part is just, like helping people, like in getting, that early feedback of like, oh wow, this is like really helpful. Like I think a lot of people, like, technically my books don't assume any prior knowledge. Like we
Mm-hmm.
start out like, what is data, and like what is rows and what is columns. But the sweet spot seems to be the people who've like tried to learn to code before and like thought it just was like really boring, or like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like they call it, I got it, I wasn't even aware of it before, but tutorial hell. Like people just like going through these, hello world tutorials that kind of take forever. And
Yeah.
so, helping people like really kind of get like spun up pretty quickly, and like doing things and talking about why we're doing things and like having people respond to that, I would say has been the most
Right.
kind of rewarding and fun part.
Yeah, that's pretty great. So last question for you. You've got all these sports. So I'm guessing you're a Bucks fan,
Y-
Packers fan,
Yep.
Brewers fan.
Yep.
Okay, what about hockey and soccer? Do you have
And
favorites there?
hockey, I like the Blackhawks.
Okay.
Um, I'm not, not like too plugged in, but I was originally born in Chicago, so
Okay.
that's, good enough for me to,
Right. But not a Bears
uh,
fan.
no,
Not
not a Bears fan. Nope,
Wisconsin.
nope.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely,
You'd get in
definitely.
trouble if you rooted for
Yeah,
anybody else. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. And soccer, I'm pretty, I'm pretty agnostic. So in the book, we cover the World Cup data.
Okay.
Um, that's like the data. That's the
Right.
data I found and good. And so I'm always cheering for the U.S. Then I have a
Right.
friend who's really big into MLS and likes the Minnesota Loons. So
Okay. They all have
yeah,
good names. I will say
yeah,
that. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Madison has a team now too with it's like a minor league team or whatever, the Flamingos. Like
Oh, really?
from when
That's
they
pretty
covered
good.
Bascom Hill and all the flamingos. They
Oh,
kind of
yeah, that's
adopted the
pretty
name.
good.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Well, if you end up writing a Formula One Python book,
yeah, for sure.
my son will be into that one,
Yeah, definitely.
which is another one of those sports where there's just once you start getting even knee deep into it, you see how much data there is,
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
and can understand a ton about it.
Yeah, I've been really into golf recently, so I got my putter here in the background. So
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that, but we'll see. So,
Well, they must have. I mean, it feels like all these sports now have their own processes to have tons of data.
yeah.
Not all of which they release. I did a podcast episode with Micah McCurdy earlier in the year, who runs PolicyViz,
Oh,
and we were talking about, he has a ton of hockey data, and the one question that I have is a lot of the I have a theory that a lot of hockey play shows up in the front two corners when you're watching it on TV,
yeah.
because the opposite side is where where the benches are, so there's more space. But the teams don't release that data, right? That data is
really?
like I'm sure they have it.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're sitting on it, but they haven't
Yeah.
they don't post that. They have the shot data, but not where they spend
Yeah.
right
Yep.
time. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the Formula One stuff is pretty crazy too, because they have sensors all over the cars,
Yeah.
and so they're measuring speed, but heat
Yeah.
and wind, and the exhaust coming off the car in front of you, and
Yeah.
it's kind of amazing when you start to see what they're measuring.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun, but I think it's a great idea to tap into something that people
Yeah.
love, and be able to teach them to code. So
Mhm.
so these are great. I'll put all the links to all the books on the show notes. And Nate, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. If you're interested in learning more, check out Nate's website, check out Nate's books. If you're interested in any of the sports, I think these are great opportunities to learn more about how you can engage with the data sets in baseball, hockey, basketball, soccer, etc., etc. So again, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you would be so kind, take a moment out of your day to rate or review the show on your favorite podcast provider. Just a quick little click there on the 5 stars lets more people know about the show, which helps me bring in new and better guests each and every other week. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.